thank Daniel and Robert for the discussion thus far. I think that it's important to recognise that Robert, when I asked him to give an example of a specific law where non-Muslims are subjugated in an Islamic nation under Islamic law, he only quoted the jizya, which, as Mustafa correctly outlined, is just a tax. Muslims have the same tax. It's to a greater extent in monetary terms, and likewise Muslims don't get the benefit out of it of being protected. Now, this tax has to be returned if the Muslims can't protect the non-Muslims that are paying it. Now, to answer your question, Summer, you asked, well, if I live in America, America becomes an Islamic state, and I don't want to become Muslim, I don't want to pay the tax, do I get killed? No, you don't. You'll be free to leave. And in fact, this has been practiced in multiple times throughout Islamic history. The prime example would be Salah ad-Din. Robert also, he's saying he doesn't want to appeal to history, but he does appeal to history in some of his evidences. And one of the challenges that he put forward was that every time Muslims have given this relaxed interpretation, as he says, of the law, i.e., for example, allowing non-Muslims to leave an Islamic land once conquered, they were then rejected. Well, was Salah ad-Din challenged? Was he rejected? Who was the chief physician to Salah ad-Din? It was Moses Maimonides, or as the Jews would know him, Rambam. Nobody rejected Salah ad-Din doing this. Nobody challenged him. Nobody challenged him when he let the Christians leave peacefully and not be attacked. So in reality, we've got this argument which is basically non-existent. I asked for one example. We weren't given an example. In fact, I could give examples of to the contrary of where non-Muslim nations do not present the equality, inverted commas, that Robert speaks about. Now, in the country that most of you are in at the moment, the United States, homosexual people are not allowed to get married. Is that equality? Is it equality that heterosexual people can get married and homosexual people can't? Now, in simple terms, it's normal for society to have slightly different rules for different interest groups, and to say that Muslims are unfair or unjust or unequal in their dealings with non-Muslims is just ridiculous.
Okay, Dr. Pipes, any response you have for Abdullah?
Yes, indeed. I was asked about supplying a surah of the Quran that shows that it's supremacist. But I think I've made it clear that I'm not a Quran specialist. I'm a historian. And my point was not to analyze the Quran, but to look at 1,400 years of history and to say that over 1,400 years, the driving force of Islam has almost everywhere at all times been to assert the superiority of Muslim over non-Muslim. I don't need a verse in the Quran. There are plenty of verses, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about history. I am a historian. I'm talking about history. This is the basic history of Islam, to assert superiority over non-Muslims. Now, let's talk about what happens when non-Muslims are ruled by Muslims. We've been talking about the jizya tax. And what I found fascinating is that Imam Mustafa acknowledges that were Islamic law to be applied in the United States, you, Summer, would be paying an additional tax. This is an extraordinary concession. In other words, you, as a non-Muslim, would have an onus that Muslims don't have. This is what stands in front of us should we have Islamic law. Imam Abdullah asked for other examples besides the jizya law, the jizya tax, which is not $100, which is a very, very substantial tax historically. There are many other sumptuary laws, humiliation. The entire life of the dhimmi, of the Christian, Jew, or Sabaean living under Muslim law, is one of humiliation, powerlessness, of being reminded on a daily, indeed an hourly basis that you are an inferior and that you should convert, and that you are someone living at the tolerance of Islamic law, but you're inferior. And one symbol of this, one interesting one, is that Muslim men are allowed to marry non-Muslim women, but not the reverse. There's a kind of, again, this brings together the two things, Muslim over non-Muslim and male over female. It's a profoundly unequal system of living. Islam is profoundly unequal, comes out of a tribal background, is profoundly unequal. In the 12th century or the 15th century, all the other parts of the world were also unequal. But today, when we have achieved an equality, a liberalism, a democracy, a personal freedom, Islam or Islamic law is out of date, is retrograde. It's something that you and I would despair of going back to, because we've left that. We've left these inequalities. We now have equality. And the idea that we should revert to a Shari system whereby Muslims have superiority over non-Muslims and males have superiority over females is profoundly unacceptable. And Islam needs to change. It needs to become modern. And what these two gentlemen are represent is the most retrograde kind of Islam that wants to pull us back into the medieval period, that's indeed engaged in religious attacks. No, that's not. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about history and politics and the way we live. And I'm fine with Islam, but it's got to be an Islam that's modern and that fits in, particularly as we're all four of us on this panel living in the West, has to fit into Western ways of living. We've achieved something in the West. We don't want to give it up in order to go back to the Sharia.
Mm-hmm. And with that, we will take our next call. You're live on ABN.
Hello?
Yes, you're live. What's your question and who's it for?
Hi, good evening, ma'am. My name is Rich, for short. My name is Richard for short, calling from New Jersey. Big text, my friend. And I had a question for the panel here. Gentlemen, hello, assalamu alaikum, shalom. That covers it all. My question for each of you is that what real-world exposure do you have to the opposite side? To the Muslim men, do you have any Christian friends that you attend celebrations or churches? To the Christian men, do you have any Muslim friends who attend their festivals? Let me simplify it. I'm in the service, and I work with Muslim people, Muslim soldiers, and we attend each other's functions. I've been deployed with them, no problems at all. And even when I was in Iraq, I saw Christians and Arab Christians and Arab Muslims get along peacefully. So they were kind of like new term for me. Thank you for your answers. God, Allah, Yahweh, bless you and have a happy holiday.
Okay, I think two things. One, I'd like Imam Mustafa to respond, but I think that the key behind his question was possibly something like, why can't Muslims and Christians possibly coexist peacefully? Imam Mustafa, did you want to address that?
Of course they coexist peacefully. I grew up with Christian friends in Egypt. Tomorrow I'm visiting one of my Christian friends and his family with my father, who's his best friend, is that Christian man who I call uncle. I want to make clear that to validate the peaceful aspect of Islam that is mandated by the Quran and the Prophet of Islam, I don't have to prove that by having to have Christian friends and Jewish friends. I can be peaceful and I might not come along with them in certain ways, or just not happen to have interaction with them on a business aspect or not. Having said that, I speak in churches oftenly. I have some of my best friends who are priests, pastors. Some of my good friends are Jewish. I was in the financial markets before, and some of my best friends were Jewish. I live in New Jersey like the gentleman, and again, all the notions that we heard before, the subjugation, the history, and so on and so forth, is not true by practice. Mr. Pipes mentioned that you have to pay an additional tax if Islam was applied in America. He misunderstood what I said. A non-Muslim pay a certain tax, and a Muslim pay a certain tax. The non-Muslim tax pays only 1 dinar, that is $100 per year. He can fight with Mr. Spencer because even Mr. Spencer admitted that in his book. The other aspect of being a Zimmi is to be exempt from Islamic law. He said there's a lot of inequality between women and men in Islam. In inheritance, the 34 potential cases of inheritance, 30 of them the woman inherits the same, more, or the man doesn't inherit whatsoever. The third thing is that Mr. Pipe said that there's so many verses in the Quran, but he would still quote history. And I thank Brother Abdullah for bringing the case of Musha bin Maymun, who is not only considered one of the leading Islamic philosophers, but he wrote the Torah Mishnah, one of the fundamental books of Judaism, in Arabic. Tell me if that is subjugated or not. And he was the private physician of Salahuddin, the one who defended the Crusaders. One of the brightest examples about that is at the time of the Crusaders that caused the death of 6 million Muslims. No reports whatsoever of local Christians being hurt in retaliation of the aggressions that happened. And I am the first one to admit that the Crusades got